Beneath the labels of net worth, legal contracts, and social bias, we all hide a heart that longs to be seen with kindness rather than being treated like a line item on a ledger. The real story usually begins the exact moment you decide to set aside your assumptions and open your mind to the truth. It all started 8 months ago on a late Tuesday night as I was walking home from my bookstore. I was rounding the corner of Elm Street and Fifth Avenue when I spotted an elderly woman collapsed on the sidewalk. She was a petite woman with bones as delicate as a bird. She wore simple, modest clothes that seemed far too thin for the chilly night air. It looked as though she had simply run out of strength mid-stride and folded onto the concrete. I called for an ambulance, and when she finally came to, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. I could feel the sharp outline of every bone in her fingers as she held on. In a voice as raspy as dry parchment, she told me I had a kind face and lamented that men like me were a dying breed in this world. I eventually learned her name was Grandma Violet. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't fully grasp until much later, was that she was the matriarch of one of the most powerful dynasties in New York. Her granddaughter, Sarah, ran a massive global empire from a sleek glass skyscraper in the heart of the city. None of that mattered that night under the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room. Sitting there next to that frail woman, she wasn't a tycoon. She was just someone who shouldn't have to be alone. So I stayed by her side. Over the next few months, she became a regular at my shop. She would sip tea I brewed on a small stove in the back room while sharing stories about her late husband. She had this wonderful, uninhibited laugh that only belongs to people who have reached an age where they no longer care about making a good impression. I grew genuinely fond of her. Eventually, her stories began to focus on a very specific, recurring topic. She would always start by folding her hands neatly in her lap and saying, "My granddaughter, Sarah." With a look of practiced innocence, she would fret about how Sarah worked too hard and never ate enough. She told me it had been years since Sarah had given a real smile, not the polished version used for press photos, but a genuine expression of joy. She claimed she couldn't even remember the last time it happened. I would just listen and nod, keeping her teacup full. Violet would insist that Sarah needed someone grounded and reliable, someone who wouldn't be dazzled by her wealth, but could see the woman beneath the title. I always gave her a polite smile, but I never took her matchmaking seriously. That changed one morning when she walked in with a bag of pastries and a marriage contract hidden inside. She handed it to me with the same casual air someone might use to recommend a new brand of jam. I have to be honest, I actually said yes. My reasons had nothing to do with romance. My older sister, Lisa, had been in a long, quiet Cold War with her husband because I was still crashing in their guest room at 25. It was a constant source of friction in their marriage. The tension in their home felt like a low hum of electricity, tainting every meal and making every casual conversation feel forced. I love my sister more than anyone else in the world, and I couldn't stand being the reason for her unhappiness. Every time I walked through their front door and saw the strain on her face, it felt like a lead weight in my chest. So when Violet told me her granddaughter had finally agreed, even while admitting it was with extreme reluctance, I saw an exit strategy. I figured it would give me a place of my own and finally let Lisa breathe again. I hoped that maybe things would work themselves out over time. However, Violet failed to mention the true extent of Sarah's hesitation. Sarah had only caved because of her grandmother's relentless pressure and a sense of debt she deeply resented. She had been raised to be fiercely independent, trained from birth never to rely on a single soul. To her, feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford. Marrying a complete stranger, a simple bookstore owner, must have felt like a personal insult. I could easily picture her describing me with cold indifference, viewing the whole arrangement as a humiliating surrender. Despite her cold exterior, she adored her grandmother. So, she made a private pact with herself. She would hide her true status and pretend to be nothing more than a middle-class office worker to see who I really was. She planned to watch me like a hawk. If I turned out to be a decent man, a true gentleman, she would consider giving the marriage a real shot. But if I proved her right and turned out to be a fraud, if I was just a gold digger who had charmed an old woman to get to her fortune, She would have all the evidence she needed to dump me. She was prepared to cut me out of her life within 6 months. I had no clue about any of this as I stood in the lobby of the Skyline Apartments. I pulled out my phone and went to my messages. I had her saved under the simple name, Sarah Miller. We had only just exchanged contact info this morning in a courthouse hallway, still wrapped in our winter coats. The ink on our marriage license was barely dry, but her grandmother was already clutching it to her chest like a sacred relic. I sent her a quick iMessage letting her know I had arrived at the building but didn't know which unit was hers. As I hit send, a notification popped up that made my stomach drop. It simply read, "This person is no longer sharing their status with you." I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of the message. I checked the number, and it was correct. We had literally just gotten married 5 hours ago, yet I was already being ghosted. Much later, she admitted what had actually happened with a mix of guilt and embarrassment. She had been in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting when her phone started vibrating on the table. Her phone was face up, and she saw a notification from a contact she didn't recognize. My iMessage handle at the time was Brave Strawberry, a relic from an old joke with my sister. She hadn't bothered to save my actual name yet. Seeing a notification from something called a Brave Strawberry in the middle of a serious meeting, she didn't even hesitate. She swiped left, rejected the message, and deleted me from her phone entirely. Looking back, it was the perfect introduction to the world of Sarah Miller. I gave up on the text and called her grandmother instead. She picked up almost instantly. Violet sounded relieved to hear from me, like she'd been sitting by the phone waiting for the call. I told her I'd officially moved out of Lisa's place and was currently standing in the lobby, but realized I didn't have Sarah's unit number. There was a brief pause before she let out an exasperated sigh. She admitted she didn't know either since Sarah had just bought the place. She told me to stay put while she gave Sarah the peace of her mind. She hung up so fast, I didn't even get to say goodbye. I can only imagine the scene in that boardroom when her grandmother's call broke through. Normally, Sarah wouldn't leave a meeting for anything, but her grandmother was the one exception to her rules. She was forced to take the call. With an expression that looked like she was swallowing broken glass, she answered. After a few seconds of being lectured, she blurted out the address, Building B, Unit 808. Violet apparently told her that her husband was wandering the lobby like a lost piece of mail and ordered her to add me back on iMessage immediately. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a new contact request. I accepted it, and she immediately sent an apology, claiming she hadn't recognized the number. I told her it was no problem and to get back to her work. She followed up by asking if I needed any help with my things. I looked down at my single suitcase. I had purposely traveled light because the apartment was fully furnished. I didn't want to show up at a stranger's door with a moving truck full of my life's clutter. It felt too much like an invasion. I told her I only had one bag and could manage on my own. She replied that she wouldn't have been able to leave work to help anyway. I just sent back a facepalm emoji, the universal sign for I get it. I pocketed my phone and took the elevator up to the 8th floor. The apartment was massive, far larger than I had expected. It had 4 bedrooms, 2 full baths, and 2 separate living areas. The kitchen looked like a set from a high-end home magazine, and the 2 balconies offered a stunning view of the skyline. Walking through the rooms felt like visiting an art gallery. I was acutely aware that none of this actually belonged to me. The place was immaculate and perfectly decorated, but the kitchen was a desert. There wasn't a single pot, pan, or even a basic cutting board in the entire place. The refrigerator was a void, echoing with a lonely hum. Aside from a bottle of Fiji water and a sad, plastic-wrapped half-lemon, it was completely empty. I picked the smallest of the guest rooms to set up camp. It was an east-facing room with good light. I dropped my bag and sat on the edge of the bed, realizing that Sarah likely never ate a single meal at home. The beautiful kitchen was just for show. I pulled out my phone and went on Amazon, ordering a complete set of pots, pans, knives, and basic pantry staple for next-day delivery. Once that was done, I headed back to the bookstore to finish my shift. Staying in that silent, empty apartment felt far more awkward than just going to work. It was after midnight by the time I made it back. The entire place was draped in shadows. I took a quick, quiet walk through the rooms. Every door was open, and there was zero sign of life. I figured she was either pulling an all-nighter at the office or had a couch in her suite. Given what I knew about her, both seemed likely. I slid the deadbolt into place and took a quick shower. I was out cold by 1 a.m. I don't know how much time had passed before a sudden noise jerked me awake. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding. It sounded like someone was trying to break the door down or using it as a drum. I lay there for a few seconds, my brain slowly processing the sound. The realization hit me, and I threw back the covers. I marched toward the front door in my boxers, too annoyed to check my phone or even grab shirt. I started shouting before I even reached the handle. I was half asleep and completely fed up with whoever was making such a racket at this hour. I yelled through the wood, demanding to know who was pounding on the door at 3 in the morning. I threw the bolt back and yanked the door open. Sarah Miller was standing there in the hall. She looked absolutely livid. It was a cold, simmering kind of rage, the look of someone who had been holding it together by a thread and was finally ready to snap. Her eyes were blazing, and her jaw was set so tight it looked painful. We stood there staring at each other for a long beat. I finally managed to mutter a greeting, calling her Miss Miller because it was the only name I had for her. I stepped aside and told her to come in. She brushed past me without a word, her shoulder making sharp contact with mine as she headed for the sofa. She sat down with a rigid, forced composure, like she was using her silence as a weapon. I went to the hall closet and pulled out a pair of simple slippers I'd bought for the apartment. I set them down by her feet and started to explain myself. Her silence was deafening, filling the room with a heavy weight. I told her I hadn't made it back until after midnight and that the place had been pitch black. I explained that I'd assumed she was staying at the office and had bolted the door out of habit. I admitted I should have checked with her first and offered a sincere apology. She glanced at the slippers and then back up at me. She closed her eyes for a long moment. I could see the tension in her frame shift. She wasn't relaxing, but the immediate fury seemed to be simmering down into something else. When she finally spoke, her voice was level and devoid of the razor-sharp edge from a few moments ago. She told me flat out that I didn't need to worry about her. She reminded me that it was her apartment and that she was beyond annoyed at being locked out of her own home. I told her I understood and promised to check in before locking up next time. I suggested that she just let me know if she was going to be out of town or working late. She stayed quiet for a while, clearly debating whether my explanation was acceptable. She finally spoke with the tone of someone used to giving orders. She warned me not to expect her home every night and made it clear she didn't have time for check-in calls. She told me that unless I heard otherwise, I was to assume she was coming home. I just nodded and told her I got the message. She looked exhausted, her posture betraying the long hours she'd put in. I asked her if she wanted anything to eat. She snapped that she never ate after 9 p.m. She claimed it ruined her sleep and went straight to her hips. She paused and then added with icy precision that she had a perfect figure and intended to keep it that way. I couldn't help but let out a small, genuine smile at her bluntness. I told her she was absolutely right. I noticed a tiny, almost invisible shift in her expression. The hostility didn't vanish, but some of the tension seemed to bleed out of the room. She gave me a curt good night, and I returned the sentiment. I backed away slowly, treating her like a bomb that might still go off. I carefully shut my bedroom door and listened to the faint sounds of her moving around the apartment. I heard the click of her door and the distant sound of the shower. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the fact that she had actually put on the slippers I bought. It felt like a small win. I was up by 6 a.m. the next day. The apartment was still and bathed in the pale light of dawn. I crept into the kitchen in my socks, tried to be as quiet as possible. I stood staring at the empty cabinets for a minute with my hands in my pockets. Finally, I decided to head out and find some breakfast. I realized I had no idea what kind of food Sarah actually liked. She struck me as someone who ate out of necessity rather than pleasure, viewing food as fuel rather than a hobby. I decided to cover all the bases and bought soup dumplings, scallion pancakes, and some fresh porridge. I grabbed a bag of fresh rolls and 2 hot soy milks to go. I wanted to make sure she had plenty of options regardless of her mood. She was already up by the time I got back. I found her standing in the middle of the living room in a set, of ivory silk pajamas. We locked eyes for a split second, both of us frozen in place. She let out a sharp, choked gasp and bolted back toward her bedroom with a speed that was impressive for someone who had just woken up. I stood in the doorway with a bag in each hand, my face burning with embarrassment. When she finally came back out, she was fully dressed and wore an expression that was somewhere between being mortified and being annoyed. She glared at me with a focused intensity, clearly deciding that a good offense was the best defense against her own embarrassment. I quickly apologized, explaining that I'd just been out for breakfast. I admitted I should have knocked and took the blame for the awkward encounter. She just stared at me in silence. I could tell her brain was working overtime. She was clearly debating whether to admit she'd forgotten I lived there or to double down on blaming me for the whole thing. After a long pause, she finally sat down at the table. She looked at the spread I was laying out and asked me if I didn't know how to cook. I told her I was actually a pretty decent cook, but pointed out that her kitchen was completely bare. I joked that even a world-class chef needs more than a bottle of water and a lemon to make a meal. She started to say something but stopped herself, looking toward the kitchen before admitting that she almost never ate at home. I told her I'd noticed and set a sampling of everything in front of her. I mentioned that the new kitchen gear was arriving today and that I planned to head to the market for actual groceries later. I told her that living on takeout wasn't sustainable for her health. She looked at the food with a cautious curiosity. She picked up a spoon and started on the porridge, keeping her eyes glued to the bowl as she spoke. She told me that since we were legally married, I should feel free to treat the apartment as my own and decorate it however I liked, with the obvious exception of her bedroom. I sat down and joined her for the meal. We ate in a silence that felt heavy with things unsaid. Eventually, she reached into her purse and slid a credit card across the table toward me. She wrote down the PIN on a scrap of paper and told me to use it for all household expenses. She made it clear she didn't care about the cost, but she expected a detailed record of every cent spent. I took one look at the card and slid it right back to her. I told her that she had already provided the roof over my head, which was more than enough. I insisted on covering the costs for groceries and basic household needs myself. I told her I'd only check with her if a single purchase went over $2,000. She gave me a skeptical look, reminding me that I was just a small bookstore owner. I just smiled and agreed. She seemed confused that I could afford the upkeep of such a massive place. I simply told her that I wasn't the kind of man who let his wife pay for the groceries. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes that I couldn't quite name. She was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her CEO voice had completely vanished. She sounded much more human as she gently pushed the card back toward me. She reminded me that we were technically a family, regardless of the strange circumstances of our marriage. She told me to take the card, acknowledging that I had my own income and my own pride. She insisted she wasn't trying to insult me, but rather just wanted us to share the burden of living together. I watched her as she looked away, her gaze landing somewhere over my left shoulder. I was stunned to realize that this small moment of genuine connection was actually making her feel incredibly vulnerable and awkward. This was a woman used to commanding rooms full of titans, yet she was struggling to handle a simple, sincere conversation. I finally took the card and thanked her. To break the tension, I asked her if she had any requests for dinner tonight. She stood up and grabbed her coat, telling me she would be happy with whatever I decided to make. She paused at the door with her hand on the frame, and without looking back, she whispered that I hadn't been obligated to buy her breakfast. I told her I knew, and then the door clicked shut behind her. I sat there alone in the morning light with our empty soy milk cups. I felt a strange shift in the air between us. It felt like a door that wasn't quite open yet, but was no longer locked tight against me. It was Henry's idea to go to that gala, which in hindsight was a guaranteed sign of trouble. Henry Mercer has been my best friend since we were 19. We bonded over our mutual hatred for mandatory college gym classes and built a friendship that has survived a decade of shared embarrassments and hard times. Henry came from old money, the kind built on blocks of prime Manhattan real estate. They were wealthy enough to never worry about a bill, but not quite at the level where they stopped keeping track of their net worth. His mother was currently on a mission to see him married off, and she was attacking the task with the kind of intensity most people reserve for a career. It was as if her entire life had been a prelude to this matchmaking. He showed up at the shop on a Thursday, looking like a man who had just lost a fight he never wanted to be in. He told me his aunt had scored invites to a gala at the New York Palace Hotel. He warned me it was a real high society affair, with white glove service and those tiny, overpriced appetizers that are smaller than a quarter. I told him no, without even looking up from the shelf I was stocking. He came around the counter and put his hands on my shoulders, begging me to go. He complained that his mother was literally ambushing him with spreadsheets of eligible women. He said the lists even had columns for their family assets. I still refused until he mentioned the catering was by Pierre Beaumont. He told me the appetizers alone were $40 a pop. That was enough to make me reconsider. So there I was on a Friday evening, standing in the lobby of the New York Palace Hotel in my second-best suit jacket. I felt out of place the second I walked in. I watched men in suits that cost more than my apartment stepping out of cars that were worth more than my entire business. Henry's aunt, Patricia, was a sharp woman who made no secret of her desire to see her nephew married off to the right family. She met us at the door with a smile that felt a little too tight. She demanded to see Henry's invite and inspected it herself instead of letting the valet handle it. She leaned in and started whispering like she was letting us in on a state secret. She told him to keep his eyes open and his mouth shut until she found the right moment to introduce him to some high-quality women. Henry just nodded solemnly and promised to behave. The second her back was turned, he nudged me toward the nearest tray of hors d'oeuvres. We retreated to a small corner table that was mostly hidden behind a massive floral arrangement. The bouquet of peonies and eucalyptus probably cost more than my monthly rent. We hid there with our plates, feeling safe from the socialites. We had our plates piled high, with as much food as we could carry. Henry looked completely satisfied as he declared us invisible while stabbing his second jumbo shrimp. He called it the perfect stealth mission. Then, a sudden, heavy silence fell over the ballroom. It wasn't a natural lull in conversation. It was the sound of 200 people stopping what they were doing at the exact same moment. Both of us sat up straight immediately. I tried to see what was going on at the entrance, but the crowd was too thick and our corner was tucked away at a bad angle. All I could see was a ripple moving through the room, like wind across a field of grass. People were turning and shifting their weight, all of them gravitating toward a single point of interest. I asked who it was, but Henry couldn't see either. I eventually gave up trying. Whatever force of nature had just entered the room, it was invisible from our little hiding spot. I sat back down and grabbed another bruschetta, deciding the catering was far more interesting than the local gossip. I just sat there, happily focused on my mountain of food. I had no way of knowing that the woman who had just caused the entire room to stop breathing was the same one I'd given slippers to the night before. She was the same woman whose coffee mug I'd found in the sink just a few hours earlier. It was the first sign she'd even used the kitchen. I was technically living with Sarah Miller, but I had absolutely no idea who Sarah Miller really was. I only learned the details much later, but apparently one of Sarah's security detail, a massive guy named Carter, had spotted me from across the room. He had the kind of eagle eye you only find in top-tier bodyguards. He had locked onto me before I even knew he existed. He watched me working the buffet line with the single-minded focus of a hungry man and recognized me in an instant. He waited until Sarah had finished her obligatory rounds of small talk before leaning in and whispering that he'd spotted Mr. Miller in the corner. Sarah gave a nearly invisible nod and asked where I was. Carter pointed toward our table by the east window and told her I was with a friend, mostly focused on the buffet. After a brief pause, she told him to keep a close eye on me. She wanted to know who I was talking to and ordered him to take some photos of me without getting caught. She stayed on her side of the ballroom while I stayed in my corner. There were 60 feet and a sea of people between us. Neither of us had any idea the other was even there. Later that night, in the back of her town car, she scrolled through the photos Carter had snapped. They were grainy shots of me carefully constructing a tower of hors d'oeuvres like a master architect. Apparently, her expression was impossible to read as she looked at them. Henry and I left the party the same way we had arrived, slipping out a side exit to avoid any more social obligations. We didn't want Patricia to ambush us and try to force Henry into a conversation with another heiress. As we were heading out, we ran into Lisa Quinn near the main entrance. She appeared out of nowhere to say goodbye. She asked if we were really leaving so early, her eyes darting between Henry and me with a look that was half amused and half disappointed. She caught up with us just as we were finishing our goodbyes. Henry gave her a shrug and used the old, "I have work in the morning" excuse. She turned to me then, her tone shifting to a plea as if she had already given up on Henry. She told me I could stay longer and mentioned that the keynote speaker hadn't even started yet. I reminded her that I wasn't even technically on a guest list and was just there as Henry's plus one. I gave her what I thought was a friendly smile as I turned to leave. She clearly read something else into the look because she stared at me for a beat too long before finally looking away. Lisa followed us all the way to the corner, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement. She stood there watching as we flagged down a cab. Henry told me to get in, noting the cold. As we pulled away, she gave a small wave. I could see her in the mirror, looking thoughtful as we disappeared into traffic. I didn't give another thought. My only concern at the moment was whether the noodle shop near the apartment was still serving. I didn't find out the rest of the story until much later. I pieced the details together from Carter's security reports and Sarah's own admissions. She had been watching me the entire time. She was standing by the main bar, surrounded by a group of VPs and sipping on a glass of sparkling water. She never touched alcohol at these events. She was pretending to listen to some guy ramble about a new waterfront development when Carter leaned in. He informed her that I was heading out. Without even turning her head, she asked if I was alone. Carter told her I was with Henry. After a brief silence, Carter added that Lisa Quinn was the one seeing us out. Sarah started slowly rotating her glass between her fingers. She stood there and finished listening to the rest of the boring briefing. When the keynote ended, she gave a polite, measured round of applause. She was the last of the VIPs to leave the building, as was her custom. Once she was safely in the car, she pulled out her phone. She spent the entire ride home scrolling through the photos Carter had taken. The one she looked at the longest was a candid shot of me. I was standing in the buffet line with a plate, looking intensely conflicted about whether to choose the scallop ceviche or the duck. I had this look of pure, innocent determination, like I was at an $800 plate gala with the sole purpose of eating my money's worth. She swiped to a shot of me in my slightly rumpled suit jacket, leaning over the table. I was telling Henry a joke, and he was doubled over laughing. It was a moment of total authenticity, with no posing or social climbing involved. There was no networking or desperate business card swapping. It was just two guys having a great time at a party where they clearly didn't belong. The last photo showed Lisa Quinn standing just behind me. She was looking at my profile with a very specific expression on her face. It was the look of someone staring at something they desperately wanted. Sarah flipped her phone over and set it on the seat with a sigh. She gave the driver the address of the Skyline Apartments. I beat her home by about 20 minutes. The place was dark and silent, having that lonely feeling common to luxury apartments at 2 a.m. I changed in my sweats and pulled out the container of stinky tofu I'd picked up from a vendor a few blocks away. I was just about to dive in when I heard the key in the lock. Sarah walked in looking like $1,000,000, her coat still perfectly buttoned and her heels still on. It was like she didn't know how to turn off the CEO mode and just relax. I told her I hadn't expected her home so soon. She reminded me that she actually lived there and set her purse on the table. Then she caught sight of my late-night snack. Her face twisted into a look of pure disgust. She asked what the smell was, and I proudly announced it was stinky tofu as I flipped open the lid. The pungent smell immediately took over the room. I told her it was from the place on Fifth Avenue and explained the fermentation and frying process. I admitted it was an acquired scent, but insisted the flavor was incredible. I mentioned that my father had been obsessed with the stuff. Sarah sat down on the far end of the couch, making sure to keep as much distance as possible. She pulled her feet up and looked at me with a pained expression. She begged me to take the food out to the balcony, unable to even finish her sentence because of the odor. I shrugged and took my tofu outside. I didn't mind. The The city looked beautiful at night with all the lights reflecting off the buildings. The city felt alive, even at this hour. I kicked my legs up on the new patio chair I'd bought and watched the traffic crawl by below me while I ate in peace. I went back inside, fully aware that I probably smelled like a fermentation vat. Sarah scrunched up her nose, but didn't say anything. She just watched me with an inquisitive look. I knew that look. It usually meant a barrage of questions was coming. She asked if I'd closed up early tonight, and I told her I hadn't been at the shop at all. I mentioned that I'd been at a gala at the palace with a friend. I sat down on the other end of the couch, giving her plenty of space. I commented on how impressive the hotel was and mentioned some of the rumors I'd heard about the family that owned it. I noted that a woman named Violet apparently ran the show. I asked if they were related given the name. Sarah looked at me for a beat before claiming they were just very distant relatives from several generations back and that they had zero connection. I let out a long breath of relief, which is hilarious in hindsight. I told her it was a huge weight off my mind. She looked at me like I was crazy and asked why I was relieved. I told her I didn't mean to be rude, but that being connected to that kind of power would make our whole situation feel incredibly bizarre. I told her families like that were playing a different game. It would feel like I'd stumbled onto a battlefield without knowing any of the rules. I leaned back and mentioned a rumor that the whole room went silent when the matriarch walked in. I told her I'd heard she was a real ice queen who never let anyone get close. People were saying she was particularly cold toward younger men and was still single. I just shrugged and said there was probably some dramatic backstory, or she was just married to her job. Sarah went completely still. She asked me, in a very measured voice, why I assumed the woman was old. I told her it was common sense. You don't become a family matriarch and a CEO by 25. I figured she had to be in her late 30s at the very least, which is old to someone my age. Sarah whispered that 35 wasn't exactly ancient for a 25-year-old. I just nodded. She stood up abruptly and announced she was going to shower. Her voice was cold and detached as she bid me good night. I watched her walk away with her back as stiff as a board, wondering what I'd said to set her off. I eventually decided that rich people are probably just weird about their age. I made a mental note of it and went to bed. Saturday morning rolled around, and so did Grandma Violet. She'd call me the night before check-in. She sounded like she'd been planning this for weeks and was finally ready to pull the trigger. She announced that it was time for our families to officially meet. She insisted it wasn't just for the parents, but for the whole extended family. She wanted everyone to be on a first-name basis. She said she didn't want us bumping into relatives on the street and not knowing who they were. To my surprise, Sarah agreed to the plan with a sort of weary, elegant grace. She looked like someone who had finally realized that arguing with Violet was a losing battle. I was up at 5 a.m. to get a head start. I'd convinced Sarah to hit the farmer's market with me. There's something special about cooking the first big meal in a new home. I wanted everything to be perfect. By 6 o'clock, the smell of fried noodles was already filling the apartment. I gave her a wake-up call at 6:15. She sounded like she was in physical pain when she answered. She told me she'd be ready in 10, and I told her breakfast was on the table. There was a long, pointed silence on her end. She eventually asked when I had woken up, and when I told her it was just after 5, she didn't say a word. She appeared 30 minutes later, perfectly dressed and composed. Her usual robotic expression seemed to have softened into something that looked suspiciously like genuine appreciation. She sat down across from me and ate her noodles in silence. We left for the market just as the sun was starting to break through the New York morning haze. I've thought about that morning a lot lately. We walked through the stalls together, and she was nothing like the woman I'd seen in the apartment. She stopped to smell the fresh basil and tarragon. She picked up a peach with both hands and inspected it with a look of pure wonder, as if she were trying to decide if it was actually real. She asked the fishmonger about the catch time for the sea bass, her voice sounding a bit more grounded than usual. Beneath that corporate armor, she was genuinely curious about the world. It was a surprising, warm trait that felt like a sudden ray of sunlight through a crack in a dark room. Violet called to say they were in the lobby just as we were heading back to the car. I was pushing the cart while Sarah carried the heavy canvas bags. I had my phone pinned between my ear and shoulder. I could practically hear the grin on Violet's face over the line. She had this rich, satisfied laugh, the sound of someone whose plan was coming together perfectly. She asked if Sarah really went to the market, and I confirmed that we had even bought some sea base. She repeated sea base like it was a sacred mantra and asked to speak to her granddaughter. I watched Sarah's face as she took the call. She had this look I couldn't quite place. It wasn't exactly soft, but it wasn't her usual annoyance either. It was something far more complicated. She looked like someone who had just been seen for who they really were, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. By the time everyone arrived that afternoon, the mood in the apartment had completely shifted. Violet's son and daughter-in-law had clearly been told to play the part of a middle-class retired couple. I found the whole charade a little confusing. I just shrugged it off as another weird New York quirk. They were friendly enough and easy to talk to. Sarah's youngest cousin, a college student, was there too. For the first 10 minutes, she looked like she was about to burst into laughter every time she looked at Sarah. Sarah was currently in the kitchen, attacking a bunch of scallions with the focus of a surgeon. I walked in and asked her exactly how much dish soap she had used. She wouldn't look at me, but I noticed her ears were turning a bright shade of pink. She admitted she might have overdone it, given that the bottle was half gone. I stepped up beside her to help, watching her move through the massive pile of bubbles with a strange, careful precision. She seemed a little on edge. I told her I'd take it from here and reach for the brush. She hesitated for a second before handing it over. She didn't leave, though. She just stood there watching me like she was trying to learn the correct way to wash a plate without looking too interested. She eventually muttered that we should just go to a restaurant next time. I told her that was fine with me, but I just wanted to make a good impression for our first family dinner. I told her it felt right to have the first meeting at home. After a long silence, she tentatively asked what her grandmother had said to me when we were alone. I gave her a grin, still focused on the dishes, and told her Violet had asked if we were sleeping in separate beds. Sarah let out a strangled kind of noise. I told her she'd encouraged me to be more aggressive and had actually used the word pounce. I caught her eye and mentioned that she'd also brought up having twins in her life savings. Sarah went completely silent. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of a very private emotion cross her face before she quickly masked it again. She set her jaw and walked out of the room. Once I finished up, I grabbed a cup of tea and headed out to the balcony. The rocking chair gave a welcoming creak as I sat down. The low hum of the city rose up from below, accompanied by a cool breeze off the East River. I heard her coming before I saw her. She stepped out onto the balcony with 2 pieces of paper in her hand, looking like a judge about to deliver a sentence. I took the pages from her. It was a formal contract, complete with her personal seal. She meant business. The deal was simple, a marriage in name only, with 0 expectations of intimacy. If we didn't fall in love within 6 months, we would call it quits. She offered me the deed to the apartment as a parting gift if we divorced. The last clause, underlined for emphasis, was about her grandmother's estate. I read the whole thing twice before looking up at her. She was watching me closely, clearly braced for me to get angry or feel insulted. She looked ready for a fight. I told her flat out that I had never cared about her grandmother's money. I told her I was perfectly capable of supporting myself with the shop. I'd actually assumed Violet was just a sweet old retiree living on a pension. I explained that the only reason I'd agreed to the marriage was because I needed to give my sister and her husband their space back before I ruined their marriage for good. I told her, with all due respect, that her apartment was a much bigger draw than she was as a romantic partner. She looked genuinely surprised by my honesty. I got the feeling there was something more going on behind her eyes, but I didn't push it. She told me to sign it then, and she sounded almost relieved. I stood up and used the windowsill as a desk to sign both copies of the contract. I added my thumbprint as requested and handed her one copy while shoving the other into my pocket without a second thought. She watched me for a moment, her expression unreadable. I told her she looked tired and should get some sleep, and she told me the same. I went back to my chair and started rocking slowly. The steady creak of the wood was soothing. After such a long, strange day, I finally felt at peace. She stood in the doorway watching me for another minute before heading out. I heard the front door click shut behind her. I sat there rocking in the dark, staring out at the New York lights. I thought about how exhausting it was to constantly defy people's expectations of you. The next week was a blur of adjustments. We fell into a routine of small compromises, which included one disaster of a blind date and a very memorable incident with the front door lock. That lock incident changed everything between us. It was the definitive line in the sand between who we were and who we were becoming. Henry had another blind date, and he basically guilt-tripped me into being his wingman. He was relentless until I finally gave in. He showed up at the bookstore on Tuesday, looking like he'd just been through a war. He told me his mother had set up a coffee date he couldn't get out of. It was at Willow Creek, the fanciest cafe in Manhattan. That was a clear sign that his aunt thought this girl was marriage material. Apparently, the girl was from a big family, had her own money, and was the absolute dream daughter-in-law in his mother's eyes. He begged me to be there, complaining that at 27, his mother was still ambushing him with spreadsheets of qualified women. He slapped his hands onto the counter and told me the lists even had a column for net worth. I just closed my book and sighed. I told him I'd sit at the next table over and stay out of it. He looked like a man who had just been granted a stay of execution. That reaction told me everything I needed to know about how he expected the date to go. We made it to the cafe by 7:20. His date was already there, looking perfectly polished in a custom red dress. She gave us the kind of cold, calculating look you usually see in a high-stakes boardroom. Henry was stumbling over his apologies for being 3 minutes late, tried his best to be charming. I took my seat at the table next to them. I ordered a slice of almond cake that cost more than my first car and did my best to blend into the background. Henry was actually doing okay, and the girl was smiling in all the right places. But her questions were clearly designed to vet him as a potential husband. I was actually starting to enjoy my cake and the ambient noise of the cafe when she suddenly started talking about terms. I heard every word despite my best efforts to look busy with the menu. She was listing off requirements for the dowry, the cars, and the house. She demanded his entire paycheck be direct deposited into her account and made it clear there would be no kids. She even wanted a separate house for her parents. I nearly choked on my cake. Henry's face went through an entire spectrum of emotions before settling on a shade of white I'd only seen once before. It was the same look he had when he accidentally signed up for advanced calculus in college. He stood up and excused himself to go to the bathroom. He walked away with the stiff, forced calm of someone trying not to run for the exit. I gave him a minute and a half to collect himself. I walked over to his table to grab the wallet he'd forgotten and turned to head toward the lobby to find him. I was going to catch him at the door, but then the entrance swung open and Sarah walked in. She immediately started scanning the room like she always did. It was second nature to her. She never stepped into a room without sizing up the entire floor first. I was standing right next to the girl in the red dress when Sarah's eyes landed on me. It looked exactly like I was on a date that wasn't with my wife. I had my hand on the edge of the table, and the woman in the red dress was looking up at me. I watched the gears turn behind Sarah's eyes. Within seconds, she had already come to a very specific set of conclusions. She saw me with another woman and clearly assumed the worst. She stood there, frozen, trying to process the scene. I started to say something, but right then, Henry came back around the corner. He looked a little less like he was going to vomit, having apparently finished his frantic calls to his mother and aunt. He came up to me and gave me a silent look that clearly meant he was ready to get the hell out of there. We both headed for the door, and there was Sarah standing just a few feet away with a pickup slip from the bakery in her hand. She had this look on her face that was a mix of intense restraint and pure confusion. I introduced her to Henry as my wife. Henry stopped dead in his tracks. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Sarah gave Henry a quick, calculating look before turning her focus back to me. I explained that the girl in the red dress was Henry's date and that I was just there for moral support. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I saw something flicker in her eyes that I couldn't quite put a finger on. It looked like some deep-seated tension in her shoulders had finally snapped. She gave me a sharp nod and told me to be home early. I promised I would and then asked her what she was doing at the cafe. She said her grandmother had a sudden craving for their pastries. Her tone was flat, but it told me everything I needed to know. She was realizing that the entire evening had been a setup. She could see Violet's fingerprints all over the details. The specific location, the timing, the craving, it was all too convenient. She looked toward the counter with a weary expression. When she looked back at me, she had the look of someone who knew they'd been played by a master manipulator. I told her to give my best to her grandmother. She grabbed her box of pastries and walked out without another word. Henry watched her go with a look of pure fascination, like he was studying a new species. He looked at me as if he were questioning the very laws of physics after what he'd just witnessed. He whispered that she definitely didn't look like a woman who was indifferent to me. I just told him good night and headed home. 3 days later, my scooter gave up the ghost on my way home. Henry's cousin, Lisa Quinn, who is always bubbly and full of energy, happened to be driving by. She's 3 years younger than me, and I basically watched her grow up from the sidelines of my friendship with Henry. I always thought of her as that little kid in roller skates. She pulled over the second she saw me. She hopped out and inspected the scooter with a look of intense concern, even though she clearly didn't have a clue how to fix it. She called her family's driver to arrange a tow and told me she'd have it fixed and back to me by the next day. She offered me a ride home, and I took it. I wasn't about to spend 4 hours walking across the city in the dark. I was so focused on the logistics of the tow and the repair shop that I didn't really pay attention to the subtext of our conversation. She was being incredibly attentive, asking if I needed anything from the store and looking at me constantly. I noticed it in the back of my mind, but I didn't really register what it meant at the time. She was giving me way more attention than the situation called for, but I just figured that was her personality. I didn't think anything of it. We spent the next 20 minutes chatting in the car. She asked about the shop and mentioned the little handmade gifts I'd sent her through Henry after the gala. She was asking really specific questions about my week, acting like she was genuinely interested in the answers rather than just making polite conversation. When we pulled up to the Skyline main gate, I told her she could just drop me off there since it was a secure entrance. She couldn't get past the gate anyway. I thanked her profusely and told her she was a lifesaver. She just smiled and leaned toward the passenger window as I stood on the sidewalk. She had this hopeful look in her eyes that I completely failed to understand. She suggested that if I really wanted to thank her, I could take her out to dinner, just the two of us. I said sure, but my mind was already racing, wondering if Sarah had bolted the door again. I told her we should definitely get a group together with Henry soon. I saw her smile falter instantly. She forced a smile and agreed that Henry could come along. I gave her a quick wave and swiped my key to get through the gate. I had no way of knowing that Sarah's car had passed the nearby intersection 20 minutes earlier. She had looked out the window and seen me standing on the sidewalk with Lisa. She had sat in total, icy silence for the rest of the ride home, looking like someone who had already reached a verdict without hearing the evidence. I realized something was wrong the second I tried the door at 12:15. It was deadbolt from the inside. I stood there in the hallway for a minute, trying to process why the door was locked. I sent her a message, and when she didn't reply, I tried calling. It rang and rang while I stood there in the silent hall. It felt deliberate. She finally picked up on the third try. I called her name through the phone. I apologized for calling so late, but told her I was locked out and asked if she could let me in. She spoke with a voice so cold it felt like ice water. She said she'd assumed I was staying somewhere more comfortable tonight. I just frowned and told her I didn't understand. She told me not to apologize and reminded me of our contract. She claimed she didn't need an explanation. She told me that for the next 6 months, she couldn't exactly stop me from finding a better arrangement elsewhere. I stood there staring at the wood, trying to translate the venom in her voice. I told her very slowly that I needed her to open the door right now. I demanded that she give me a clear, direct explanation of what exactly she thought I had done wrong. There was a long, heavy silence before I finally heard the bolt slide back. She sounded like she was fighting her own anger just to stay rational. I walked into the apartment to find her standing in the middle of the living room with her arms folded tight across her chest. Her face was as cold as marble. She asked me, very slowly and deliberately, who had dropped me off. I looked at her, confused, and asked how she even knew I'd gotten a ride. She repeated the question, her voice dropping an octave. I told her it was Lisa Quinn, Henry's cousin. I explained the whole situation with the scooter and how she'd help me out with a tow and a ride home. I told her she'd drop me off at the gate and asked again how she knew. She just brushed it off, saying it didn't matter. I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite rage, but was definitely close to it. It was the stinging frustration of being judged and found guilty without even a single question. I told her it was very relevant because she was standing there making some very nasty implications. I accused her of deciding I was guilty before she'd even spoken to me. She tried to say it was fine, but I told her that her tone made it clear it was anything but fine. I took a deep breath to steady myself. I told her once and for all that I wasn't a social climber or a gold digger. I told her I wasn't looking for a backup plan or another way to get paid. I explained that I'd been forced to take the train because of the scooter. I told her the only reason I got a ride was because an old friend happened to see me and offered to help. I looked her straight in the eye and reminded her that our little contract worked both ways. I told her that since she didn't want me to fall for her, she had no right to be jealous of any other woman in my life. She went to argue, but I cut her off, telling her that if she was actually jealous, we were having a very different kind of conversation. The silence that followed was heavy with things that were right on the tip of her tongue, but remained unsaid. Her ears were beet red, and she was clenching her jaw so hard I thought it might break. She was clearly having a very intense internal struggle. She finally managed to get out a no with as much dignity as she could muster. I just shrugged and said we still had a marriage to maintain, at least on paper. I called her Miss Miller again, which seemed to annoy her even more. I told her I was going to bed. I complained about my back and told her my scooter was halfway across town. I just gave her a short goodnight and left her standing there. She was still standing in the middle of the room as I walked away. As I shut my door, I heard the tiniest sound, maybe a huff of annoyance. Or maybe it was something else entirely. The next morning, I made a big bowl of noodles topped with fried eggs. I pulled the vinegar out of the cabinet and set it on the table. I told her I liked a little kick in my noodles and poured a generous amount in my bowl. I explained that the acidity cuts right through the richness of the eggs. It sounds weird, but it's addictive once you try it. She looked from the bowl to the bottle to me. I just gave her a cheerful look and brought up the night before. I reminded her she didn't know what jealousy tasted like. Before she could say no, I carefully tipped a little vinegar into her bowl. I told her, "There you go," and she just sat there staring at her bowl for the longest time. She eventually started eating. I asked her how it was, and she just said sour. I told her that was exactly what jealousy tasted like. It was sharp and sour and impossible to forget once you'd had a taste. I told her she'd never have to wonder again. She pointed her chopsticks at me with a look that said the conversation was officially over. I just chuckled into my bowl. Later that morning, my cousin called. Sarah actually offered to drive me to work. I found that very interesting, considering our fight the night before. It was the second time she'd offered in less than a week. My cousin told me my grandmother was ill. He said it was liver cancer, but they'd caught it early. She needed to come to New York for the specialized treatment. He told me that since Lisa and I were in the city, we needed to handle the hospital registration and pay the deposit. He had the nerve to tell me it was the least we could do after abandoning the family for years. I set my fork down and reminded him, very quietly, that he was 11 years my senior. I pointed out that he was 22 when my parents died, certainly old enough to be in the room when the estate was being carved up. I reminded him he'd been old enough to look out for his own interests back then. I told him our family obligations had been legally settled with a final payment years ago. That money had come out of my parents' life insurance. My aunt and uncle had used my inheritance to build themselves a new home. They had literally moved into my parents' brand new house right after the funeral and never left. There was a long silence on the line. I told him Lisa was planning to sue for the deed as soon as she had the resources. I warned him to think twice before he ever called me again to lecture me about my obligations. I hung up and blocked him immediately. Sarah hadn't missed a single syllable of the conversation. She was quiet for a long time before she offered, in a surprisingly genuine voice, to help me with any legal issues regarding the house. She said she knew some excellent real estate lawyers and told me to just ask. I watched her from across the table. She was staring in her mug, but there was a new softness in her posture, like she was extending a genuine olive branch. I thanked her and told her I'd keep it in mind. We rode to the shop in a comfortable silence. She eventually asked about my parents, and I shared some of the story. I didn't tell her everything, though. There are parts of that story even Henry doesn't know. I told her about the crash and the way my relatives descended on us like vultures. Lisa was only 15 when she had to plan their funerals and get me enrolled in school, taking on a world of adult responsibilities. No one else was willing to step up. We just tried to survive in that gap between what the world owed us and what it actually gave us. Sarah just listened. She didn't offer any platitudes or fake apologies. She didn't try to find a silver lining. She just let me talk. She eventually whispered that Lisa sounded like an incredible woman. I told her she was the best person I'd ever known. Sarah dropped me off at the bookstore in silence. As I was getting out, she leaned toward me and told the steering wheel she was glad Lisa had me. I stood there on the sidewalk for a long time after she pulled away, thinking about what she'd said. I didn't realize it then, but Lisa was keeping a very close eye on the situation from her own perspective. Lisa had built Strawberry Studios from nothing using the same grit and determination that had gotten us through her childhood. She started with a tiny production firm and reinvested every single dollar back into the business. Her first 2 films were commercial flops, but they caught the eye of the right people in the industry. She built the empire from there. She had one ironclad rule that she never broke. She never let her name be associated with the brand, letting the work speak for itself. The company had become more successful than we ever dreamed back when she was drafting business plans in the college library. When a Miller Group reached out about a potential merger, Lisa handled the call herself. She listened to their pitch and then used that specific, probing tone she always uses when she's sizing someone up. She asked who their CEO was, and when they said Sarah Miller, she went silent for a full minute. She called me immediately after and demanded an honest description of my new wife. I told her I'd only known the woman for 3 weeks, but I started thinking about the slippers and the dishes. I thought about the way she looked at those peaches and the weird vinegar habit. I remembered the way she'd listened to the story of my parents in the car. I told Lisa she was the most guarded person I'd ever met, but that I thought there was a lot more to her beneath the surface. I admitted I hadn't seen much of the real Sarah yet. Lisa asked if she was good to me, and I told her she was brutally honest. I noted that she'd never lied to me and had even offered to help with the legal battle for my parents' house. She'd been the one to bring up the lawyers. There was another long silence on Lisa's end. Lisa was clearly processing something I didn't understand. She asked me if Sarah was cold toward me. She asked if Sarah treated me like part of the decor when we were home. I thought about the morning breakfasts. Even though it wasn't her thing, she always made an effort to eat what I made. I remembered her standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway, asking if I needed a hand. I thought about the way she'd told me to be home early after the cafe incident. There was a specific weight to her words. I told Lisa that she was guarded, but definitely not cold. Lisa finally said okay and told me she wanted to see what Sarah Miller was really made of. The negotiations that followed were legendary, according to the gossip I heard from the office. Lisa didn't believe in soft tests. She was a force of nature, pushing until she found a weakness. She scrutinized every single word of the contract, pulling back on deals that everyone thought were already done. She threw in new demands with total confidence, acting like she had all the time in the world to get exactly what she wanted. Sarah's lawyers tried to walk away from the deal 3 separate times, calling it a lost cause. But Sarah forced them back to the table every single time. There was one meeting in particular that stood out. Ava, one of the assistants, told me Lisa had shown up 40 minutes late without even an apology. She sat down and immediately started demanding changes to a part of the deal that had been finalized weeks ago. Sarah's lead attorney started to protest, but Sarah just held up a hand to silence him. She shut down the entire room with a single gesture and calmly asked Lisa for her reasoning. Lisa laid out a very specific risk factor that both legal teams had completely overlooked. She explained how the current wording could leave the Miller Group vulnerable in a market they were planning to enter next year. Her proposed change actually protected the Miller Group better than the original deal. Ava was still in shock when she told me that Lisa had fought to make the deal better for us, the competition. She had basically handed us a better deal, but framed it like a non-negotiable demand. I told Ava that was just how she worked. Ava gave me a knowing look, realizing I understood Lisa better than I was letting on. I knew that Lisa's aggressive style was just a cover for her brilliant, surgical precision in business. I never told Sarah that the nightmare CEO she was venting about over dinner every night was actually my sister. I just listened to her describe the meetings and think to myself that it sounded exactly like something Lisa would do. It was fascinating to hear her deconstruct Lisa's brilliance, even as she struggled with the perceived hostility of the negotiations. I wasn't proud of keeping it from her, but it wasn't my place to reveal the truth yet. About a week before the signing, Sarah came home late. She was exhausted when she walked in and kicked off her heels by the door. She'd started leaving them there about 2 weeks ago, which felt like a small milestone in our domestic life. It was a sign she was finally getting comfortable. She stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me finish up the pasta. She told me about the meeting with Lisa that day, and I just gave her a small nod. She corrected herself, calling her the CEO of Strawberry Studios. She asked me what I thought of the CEO. I could feel her studying me, as if she were trying to figure something out. It felt more personal than professional. She sat down at the table and rested her chin on her hand. She looked like she was trying to decide if I was capable of handling something completely outside of our business arrangement. I just kept stirring the sauce and let her talk. She called the whole thing strange. She mentioned that Lisa had made a comment right as the meeting was breaking up. Lisa had looked her right in the eye and told her she hoped Sarah understood what she'd been given. Sarah was still confused by it, thinking Lisa was talking about the specifics of the deal. But the look on Lisa's face had suggested something much deeper. Sarah asked me what she should have said. Sarah told her she understood perfectly, but she was still clearly dwelling on the interaction. She wasn't sure if she'd given the right response. I set the bowls down and asked her what she thought Lisa meant. Sarah looked up at me, and we locked eyes for a beat too long. I could see her deciding to bite her tongue and keep whatever she was thinking to herself. She just said she'd figure it out eventually and commented on how good the pasta smelled. I told her it was her grandmother's recipe that she'd given me a few weeks back. I'd been waiting for the right moment to make it. Sarah set her fork down stunned. She couldn't believe her grandmother had shared the family's secret 3-generation pasta recipe with me at the shop. I told her Violet had mentioned she'd never learned it, so she'd passed it on to someone who would actually put it to use. After a long silence, I decided to twist the knife a little more, mostly for my own amusement. I told her it was the same meal Violet had made for her grandfather on their first real date. She said this occasion deserved something special. Sarah took a bite, and her whole expression changed. For a brief, very human second, she looked truly happy. She whispered that the taste was exactly right. I told her I knew. We finished the meal in a warm, comfortable silence. The night of the official signing gala arrived. I put on a real suit this time, not the rumpled jacket from before. It was a sharp charcoal gray number I usually saved for uncertain formal events. I spent a little too long fussing with my tie in the bathroom mirror. I was preparing to head to the Penthouse restaurant at the Palace. I was about to reveal myself as the founder of Strawberry Studios to a woman who still thought I was just a simple bookseller. Lisa had called 10 minutes earlier to say she couldn't make it, but her tone made it clear she was just giving me the floor. She told me she was sending her most important rep with full signing power. She paused and told me to finally be honest with Sarah. I argued that I'd always been honest, but Lisa corrected me, saying I'd only been selectively honest. The elevator doors opened, and I saw Sarah standing at the entrance to the private dining room. She looked stunning in a white pantsuit, framed by the sunset streaming through the windows. She looked like a masterpiece rather than a person. She had her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She had the poise of someone who had spent her entire life in rooms like this. She went dead still the second she saw me. I watched as her brain processed the sight of me. For once, her mask of absolute control slipped. She lost her cool for exactly 2 seconds before she forced her professional veneer back into place. Her eyes darted from my face to my suit and back again. I saw genuine, unfiltered shock in her eyes for the first time. I felt surprisingly calm as I walked toward her. It was the calm that comes when a long-awaited moment finally arrives. The moment wasn't scary. It was just honest. I called her Miss Miller. I apologized for being late and walked right past her in my seat. I could hear her team whispering behind us. I pulled the contract toward me and began signing the pages Lisa had drafted so carefully. I'd already spent 2 nights going over them at the kitchen table while Sarah was still at work. I signed my name and my title, Founder. The room went absolutely silent. I set the pen down and looked up. She was still standing by the table, looking dazed. She looked like her entire world had just been rewritten without her permission. It wasn't exactly anger or betrayal. It was the look of someone who had just realized their map of the world was all wrong. I asked everyone else to leave the room. Once we were alone, the only sound was the low hum of the city revolving outside the windows. I told her Lisa handled the PR because she preferred the work to the fame, and I was the same way. I told her the shop was real and that I loved it. I had no plans to give up the business. The handmade goods were real too. I reminded her that I'd never actually told her I was just a bookstore owner. I just left out the other half of my life. She stared at me for a long time before finally mentioning the apartment. She noted that it was certainly more convenient for work than my sister's couch. I agreed. I told her I'd signed the contract because she'd asked and the terms seemed fair at the time. I even brought up the credit card. I told her I'd kept the card because I didn't want to be rude. I looked her right in the eye. I acknowledged that this was a lot to take in and told her she could take all the time she needed to be mad. I promised to wait. She sat down across from me in the restaurant her family owned. It was a far cry from 6 weeks ago when I was hiding in the corner eating shrimp. She sat with her hands flat on the table, staring at me. After a long silence, she asked if her grandmother knew. I told her I suspected as much. I told her Violet was the sharpest person I knew. I saw a change in Sarah's face. It wasn't quite a smile yet, but there was a hint of one starting to form deep down. It was like something was trying to break through her surface. She brought up the test. I told her I'd known about it since the 3rd week. I joked that Violet wasn't exactly subtle when she was proud of herself. The hint of a smile grew a little stronger. She told me she owed me an apology, and I reminded her she'd already given me one. I told her the locked door apology was for a specific incident, but this one was for her entire outlook on our marriage. She held my gaze steadily. I had to admire her for not looking away. She didn't try to sugarcoat it. She admitted she'd judged me before we even met. She had created a version of me in her head based on all her assumptions. She admitted she'd spent the last few weeks looking for reasons to prove she was right about me and acknowledged that it was wrong of her. I sat and thought about that as I looked out at the glowing city below. I asked her why she kept coming back to the negotiations despite the pressure from Lisa and her own team's desire to walk away. She stayed quiet for a moment before admitting that Lisa's proposed changes were always logical and correct. She said that every time she reviewed the demands at home, she found they made perfect business sense. She also admitted, after a long pause, that someone she trusted had been dropping hints that the partnership was worth the trouble. I reminded her that I'd barely said anything during those dinner conversations. She gave me a look that said she knew exactly what I was doing. I told her I'd just been giving her my honest feedback on her business narrative. I told her that those conversations had been completely sincere. I admitted that I trusted Lisa's instincts and had just wanted the two of them to find common ground on their own. I told her that if I'd revealed the truth earlier, it would have tainted the deal and made everything about our marriage rather than the business. She realized I had been protecting the merger, but I told her I was protecting more than just a business deal. I told her that people protect the things they actually care about, that word seemed to hang in the air between us. Neither of us said anything for a while. Sarah finally broke the silence by suggesting we have dinner tomorrow. I saw the very beginnings of a real smile on her face as she brought up the dinner invite. I agreed, and she sounded like someone who had finally made a choice she should have made weeks ago. The news of the merger hit the papers the next morning, along with the revelation that I was the mystery founder of Strawberry Studios. The headlines were everywhere, and the business world was buzzing. No one knew whether to focus on the merger or the personal drama. Then the relatives started coming out of the woodwork. They descended on us like vultures sensing a fresh kill now that money was involved. They were blowing up my phone and Lisa's office, and even calling the main company lines. They tried to use my aunt's illness as a weapon against me, painting me as some kind of heartless monster. They tried to rewrite history, calling my 15 years of distance abandonment. In less than 2 days, they had turned the whole story into a tragedy. The tabloids were having a field day with the tycoon story. They ran stories about me abandoning my sick aunt, using grainy old photos of me from my graduation and the shop. They'd cropped the photos to make me look as cold and calculating as possible. I sat there reading the articles at the kitchen table. Sarah stood across from me, her coffee long forgotten and cold. She asked me what I needed her to do. There was no hesitation or overanalysis. She was just ready to take action. She was focused on the present moment. I looked at her and told her I didn't need anything. I told her I'd handle it. But then I asked if she'd be willing to stand with me at the press conference. She didn't even blink. She just said, of course. She set her cup down and glared at the headlines, her face set with a cold determination. It was the look she gave when she was about to do something significant. She whispered to the paper that those people had no idea who they were messing with. She looked up at me with absolute clarity and told me she would be there. The room was packed with reporters and a sea of cameras. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was the kind of charged air you only get when a room full of people is waiting for a disaster. I stood at the microphone feeling strangely calm. I'd spent a lot of time dreading the day I'd have to air my private life in public. I'd expected it to be a painful ordeal where I'd have to tear open old wounds. But instead, it felt like I was finally letting go of the burden. I began laying out the evidence. I showed the original agreements with all the signatures and figures. I had the real estate records and years of emails. Lisa had kept a perfect paper trail for years just in case this happened. I kept my voice calm and even. I knew that showing anger would only give them ammunition, and I wasn't about to give them a single bullet. I told the crowd I wasn't going to sue my relatives, despite what they had done. It was ancient history, and I had no desire to live my future in the wreckage of the past. Instead, I announced the creation of a foundation in my parents' names to help children who had lost their parents in accidents. The foundation would also focus on fighting the very kind of harassment and misinformation I was currently facing. The room went silent for a beat before a reporter raised their hand. He asked me about the rumors that my marriage to Sarah was just a calculated move to get to her money. He wanted to know if it was all just a ploy for her family's wealth. Every camera in the room swung towards Sarah. She was standing just behind my left shoulder. She hadn't said a word the entire time. I felt her shift her weight beside me. She moved closer and took a step forward. She reached out and took my arm in a firm, supportive grip. I could feel her strength radiating through the touch. She looked directly into the lenses with total confidence. She told the world she had fallen in love with my character long before she even knew my last name. She brought up the test she'd told her grandmother about. She said she'd promised to give me a good life if I passed. And then she smiled and said she was the one who had really won in the end. The room erupted in a sea of camera flashes. I knew there were hundreds of people watching us. I knew this moment was being streamed live to the whole world and would be archived forever. But all that mattered in that moment were her eyes, clear and steady and full of warmth. I recognized the look because I'd been searching for it for weeks in the quiet moments of our life together. She meant every word. That was the moment I finally understood what love really was. I'd finally lived in it long enough to understand it. It doesn't come with a grand announcement. It doesn't show up on a schedule. It grows in the quiet moments and the ordinary spaces of daily life. It's in the weight of a hand on your arm, or the way someone smells a bunch of fresh basil. Sarah's old friend, Ava, told me something interesting later. We were at a movie premiere, and she was sipping champagne with a knowing look on her face. She told me she knew Sarah was a goner within the first 2 weeks of our marriage. She said Sarah had started defending me in meetings, and Sarah never bothered defending anyone she didn't care about. She was usually too efficient for that. But she'd spend her lunch hour arguing with Ava about my character. She would critique me and then defend me in the same sentence. Ava said she knew right then that Sarah was completely gone. She was head over heels. I thought back to all those nights on the couch. I thought about her scrolling through those photos of me at the gala or the drama with the deadbolt. I thought about the contract and the vinegar and her voice ringing out in that press room. I told Ava it had taken a while to get there, and she just laughed and said the best things always do. Our story finally got its sequel. The film based on our life hit theaters on a Thursday in October. The world was more than ready for The Ice Queen and the Strawberry. It was the same story I'd drafted in the back room of my shop during our first few months together. It was a tale about two strangers navigating a marriage built on fine print and clauses. It tracked a woman's journey from fierce independence to the courage to actually love someone. I wrote it with the same brutal honesty I apply to everything I do. I believe that honesty always finds its audience if you give it enough time to shine. Sarah scrutinized every single draft with her usual precision. She made sure every fact was correct and, to my surprise, let all the moments that showed her vulnerability stay in the script. I took that as her blessing. The critics absolutely loved it. The box office numbers were even better. We held the premiere party in the main ballroom of the New York Palace Hotel. That room had become a sacred space in our personal history. The room was packed with industry titans and celebrities from every walk of life. There were directors, editors, and reporters everywhere, along with the usual crowd of hangers-on. Cela looked très bien. I don't use that word lightly. It was the only one that truly fit. She was literally glowing from within. Her expression was softer than I'd ever seen it in public. She reached for my hand during the keynote, and her grip was warm and solid. She was stunning in a dark blue gown with her hair flowing down her shoulders. She knew she was the center of attention and carried the weight of it with ease. We were standing by the bar when she gave my sleeve a little tug and whispered my name. Her voice was just for me, and there was a slight tremor in it that made me look at her immediately. She had gone deathly pale, and it wasn't from exhaustion. It was the look of someone whose body had just decided the party was over. The world around us kept spinning. The music and the chatter didn't stop. The waiters kept moving, but everything else just faded away from me. All the people and the noise became completely irrelevant. All I could see was her face. I set my drink down immediately. I turned to the guy standing next to us, some executive whose name I'd already forgotten. I told him we had to leave with the absolute authority of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. She leaned all her weight into me as our security team moved in from the sidelines. They moved with a practiced efficiency they'd been training for months. We moved through the crowd like ghosts, heading for the elevators and the waiting car. I kept talking to her the whole way, my voice low and steady. It wasn't about the words. It was just about the sound of my voice. I wanted to give her something solid and warm to hold on to. She squeezed my hand so hard my knuckles went white, but she didn't say a single word. No one prepares you for the waiting. I've sat across from some of the most powerful people in the world and decided the fate of entire companies. I've stood before a room full of reporters trying to tear me apart over a decades-old scandal. I've done things that required a level of focus and calm that most people can't even imagine. But pacing that hospital hallway outside the delivery room was the first time in my life I felt truly, helplessly terrified. Henry sent a string of texts, but I only read the first one. Violet called, and I forced myself to answer. She talked for 8 minutes about the weather at the estate and her prize roses. She was talking about her gardening projects just to keep my mind off the room behind the doors. I love her for that. I was so grateful for her. Ava sent a single text reminding me that Sarah was the strongest woman either of us had ever met. When the nurse finally appeared at the end of the hall with a smile on her face, I felt the air rush out of my lungs. Every muscle in my body finally relaxed. She congratulated me and called me Mr. Miller. She handed me a tiny, perfect bundle and told me I had a daughter. My hands, the same ones that had just signed a multi-million-dollar merger, were shaking uncontrollably. I carried her into the room where Sarah was resting. She looked utterly exhausted, but there was a new kind of peace on her face. Her hair was a mess on the pillow, and all her corporate armor and professional poise had vanished. It was just her, stripped of everything but the moment. I carefully laid our daughter next to her. Sarah whispered for me to look at her. Her voice had a softness I'd only heard a few times before, and it felt like the most precious thing in the world. She whispered that the baby had my nose. I sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. Our daughter let out a tiny, inquisitive little peep. It was the sound of a new soul testing out the world. We both just stared at her with the kind of you only feel when you've reached a destination you never thought was possible. I told her she had her mother's eyes. Sarah looked at me, her own eyes shining with a brilliance I'd never seen before. There was no mask, no armor, just pure light. She whispered that our story finally had its sequel. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. Somewhere outside the hospital room, the city was still rushing by. New York was humming through another October night, cold and indifferent to everything but itself. But in that room, there was only warmth and the weight of every mile we'd traveled to get to this moment. All the locked doors, the cold contracts, the vinegar, the stinky tofu, and the media circus had led us here. Every quiet morning we'd shared had become a part of us. The world felt exactly the right size, small, warm, and entirely ours. Real love isn't a power struggle or a game of strategy. It's two lonely souls finally finding the courage to drop their guards and take off their masks. It's turning the ordinary moments of life into a deep, irreplaceable devotion that makes even a simple bowl of noodles or a pair of slippers feel like a sacred bond.